All right. So the last time we were met in class, we were talking on how evolution occurs. Um, we discussed natural selection, which we'll go back over in this lesson. The other part, how it happens, is by artificial selection. So I'm gonna explain this one here. So artificial selection, in your notes, as it says, when humans selectively breed animals and plants. The thinking is that the canine family earliest ancestor that we know of would be the wolf. So how do we go from a wolf down to a chihuahua or even a, poodle or whatever else? The thinking is that at some point in time, a wolf had a litter of pups. And as you know, with dogs, they have a litter, and sometimes this what we call the runt, the smallest of the crew. And the thinking is that in nature, animals that are the runt or the weakest tend to be killed off either by starvation or some other means because they can't keep up with the herd or the pack. And humans somehow got their hands on this runt of a wolf. And if you have a runt, that means that it has a mutation, it has a genetic flaw that makes it smaller and weaker than its siblings. Well, smaller and weaker wolf doesn't mean unfit dog. It just means it wouldn't be a good wolf. And if you were able to have two runts of a male and female, now you have a genetic pair that has that mutation for being smaller and what's not. And if you were able to breed that runt to have puppies and then breed their puppies, and if you were to magnify that process over thousands of years, humans can now start selecting traits. And now you can go from a big wolf down to a small chihuahua. I'm oversimplifying the process, but in your mind's eye, maybe you can imagine that if you keep breeding small dogs and over time, you can get a smaller and a smaller and a smaller dog. And it does take a long time, but evolution is a change over time. This is also true of plants. As some of you know, trees have female and male flowers, and those flowers don't open up at the same time. And flowers do that, or trees do that, to avoid self-pollinating. And so we humans are now able to take the male flowers off a tree or off a vine that has fruits or vegetables that we like in shape and quality, and then we could physically pollinate the female flowers of other of that same fruit species. And now you're increasing the chances that the genes that you want within that plant will show up as those trees or that vine starts to fruit or grow fruits and vegetables. And if you magnify that over thousands of years of human development, you can see that within the pepper family, we can go from a very big hot pepper to a small one, or even some peppers that are not hot at all or don't have any levels of heat. And so that's when humans get involved. Another good example is that the original corn looked like this. This is what corn looks like in its full natural state. This is what we think of as corn. Well, it took humans hundreds of years of cultivating corn to get to this level. But if you keep selecting the traits you want, you can artificially change that species over time. And we see it with a lot of fruits and vegetables that are on the market today. So that's how artificial selection goes. The other thing to look at is how, in detail, what is the process of natural selection? Well, remember, natural selection means that Mother Nature is selecting. Now, it's not a individual choice; it's a reaction to the circumstances. And step one will be overproduction, and what that means is that you want to produce enough babies or offspring that some will survive. The example given to you is that in a salmon, the type of fish, they will lay several thousand eggs, but of the 5 or 6 thousand eggs that they produce, only 100 or 200 or about 5% may survive. Um, and if a salmon only laid a few hundred eggs, then you can see how that can lead to the end of the species. So some animals, especially the lower on the food chain they are, literally survive by making so many kids that the chances of some surviving to adulthood and continuing the species on allows it to happen. Trees are no example to this. If you've ever gone out in the summertime here in Fayetteville, all that yellow stuff that you see on your car, well, that's pollen. Well, the pine trees in our area, every morning, the male section of the tree will release its pollen into the air. That's why it gets everywhere. And what it's hoping is that as the wind takes the pollen through the air, that some of that pollen will land on a female section of another tree, and there you can have a sexual reproduction or an exchange of gametes between even plants. Plants also use bees and other insects. In the plant kingdom, your male flowers tend to be the prettier ones, and that's because they want to attract the insects first, and then some of the pollen will get stuck on the feet of the bee or the insect, and when it goes on another flower, some of that pollen can drop off, and that's how the male flower gets this stuff into other female flowers by various means. So overproduction, make enough that some will last. Within that population of plants and animals, you want what you have is variation. In your notes, I would like you to add in a statement here. And the statement is that nature loves differences. I will say again, nature loves differences. One of the things we understand is that whenever you have two organisms that are similarly genetically or genetically similar, that we're saying that, if they have an offspring, nature has a fallback plan where sometimes the offspring has really bad mutations. We see this showing up in humans when males and females of the same family procreate. Their kids come out with different mutations, and some of them put their kids at a disadvantage. And if it wasn't for medicine and hospital care and specialized therapy, a lot of those kids may not make it. And so nature wants to have new genes being introduced by differences, and they do that by making sure most animals don't mate with the same animal for a lifetime. That's called monogamy. Monogamy in the animal kingdom is very rare, and it's very rare because nature wants to make sure if you have multiple partners and multiple mates, it means that at least maybe one of those mates will give you your offspring good genes, which will increase the chance of survival. Okay. In the fish, you have some fish that have a straight tail, and so like this, and then some that have a curved tail. Okay. Now it just so happened the curved tail allows this fish to swim faster. So all of my fish with a curved tail, okay, they're gonna outswim the bears and the predators. The ones with a straight tail, well, they get eaten, and that's a terrible fish. They get eaten and they don't make it. So over time, you'll find less straight tail fish and more curved tail fish. That variation, that difference, helps it to survive. Well, what do we call that difference? Well, that difference is what we will now call an adaptation. Okay, so an adaptation is any difference in the genes, so it's a trait that helps the organism survive. Okay, that's the difference. So that genetic mistake that helps you survive will now be called an adaptation. The example given on your test is what's called a peppered moth. The peppered moth looks like this in its natural environment. It's black and with white specks, and it's normally found in a part of England where the trees are whitish and greenish. So if this guy's on this tree, like if you can't see, there he is. You can see how well camouflaged this peppered moth is. That's what the moth looks like in its natural environment. So if a bird comes along and wants to eat one of these moths, you can see very clearly that the bird will see the black moth easier and he will get eaten. Well, in the 1940s, during the Industrial Revolution, as more pollution and carbon dioxide got into the air, the plants got covered with a black smoke or a smoot. And all of a sudden, all these trees went from being whitish and greenish to being very, very dark. And all of a sudden, the peppered moths that once had a very good camouflage, their environment changed. And what happened now is that the members of the species that were once being eaten, now these guys have a natural camouflage, and these guys here can be seen by the birds. And so in the last 100 years, we've seen that this color peppered moth is now becoming fairly extinct. But this type of peppered moth, which is really pepper anymore, is now becoming the more common within that species. It just so happens that being a black moth in a black tree is an advantage. That's an adaptation. Being a peppered moth in a black tree is bad. So as the environment changes, it can change who now has the right adaptation for survival, or who nature will select. So the selection is the last step in the process if you want to think about it. But this means that you have made it to an adulthood or to breeding age, and whatever allowed you to survive is the advantage within your genes that will be passed down. So once again, the curved tail swims faster, it lives longer, and then if it's going to live longer, it will have more babies. At this point, we're going to say nature has selected you. The adaptation you have fit your environment, and you have survived, and you're one of the animals that will have babies, and then the population will tend to look more like these survivors. So overproduction plus variation plus adaptation equals natural selection. So make a bunch of babies. Hopefully they're never all going to be the same within a species, because not everyone's going to have the same mates. And then some of those within a species will have some unique genetic traits. We call those an adaptation. And if you have a good adaptations, then you have been selected. You've won the evolutionary battle.